You are standing at the edge of the water. The lagoon is calm. The reeds barely move. Somewhere behind you a child is crying to be fed, and the sound folds into 100 ordinary mornings just like this one. You do not own this land. No one does. There is no fence, no border, no word in your language for the line where one people ends and another begins. For most of human history, this was simply how things were. You have probably been told a comforting story about war, that it is something civilization invented, that it arrived late, with kings, with cities, with the first stone walls and the first men who called themselves rulers. That before all of that, your ancestors were too few, too scattered, and too busy staying alive to bother killing each other. For a long time, this was more than a guess. It was almost an article of faith, the idea that humans were gentle by default, and that only farms and property and power ever taught us to be cruel. The oldest massacre ever found says otherwise. 10,000 years ago, on the western shore of a lake in what is now northern Kenya, a group of hunter-gatherers died all at once. Not from disease, not from hunger. They were killed. The place is called Nataruk. In 2012, a team led by Marta Murazan-Lar, an anthropologist at the University of Cambridge, uncovered the scattered remains of at least 27 people and published what they found in the journal Nature. 8 of them were women, 6 were children, and of the skeletons complete enough to read, most carried the same thing written into their bones: violence. There were crushed skulls, shattered cheekbones, broken hands and ribs and knees. One man had the sharpened tip of a projectile still lodged in his skull. Another had one buried in his chest. Several of the wounds came from blunt force trauma, the plain term for a crushing blow, the kind delivered by a heavy club or a stone held in an angry hand. And then there is the detail that changes everything. Some of those projectile points were made of obsidian. Obsidian is volcanic glass, dark, sharp, and not especially common in the ground right there at Nataruk, which suggests the weapons and the people who carried them had come from somewhere else. These were not tools dropped by the group's own hunters. They were carried in from beyond the horizon. But does a scatter of broken bones really prove a war? It is a fair question, and it deserves an honest answer. Not every scholar reads Nataruk the same way. In a later response, also published in Nature, other researchers argued that the case for a single coordinated attack was not as airtight as it first looked, that some injuries were harder to interpret, and that a muddy lakeshore can shift and crack bones across 10,000 years. That disagreement is real. A skeleton can tell you a person died violently. It cannot always tell you who is holding the club or why. So you do not lean on Nataruk alone, and that is where the story deepens. Travel north to the Nile Valley in what is now Sudan, to a low ridge called Jebel Sahaba. Beneath it lies a cemetery roughly 13,000 years old, older than Nataruk, and one of the earliest burial grounds humans have ever left behind. It was excavated in the 1960s by an American archaeologist named Fred Wendorf, working fast, ahead of a dam that was about to drown the valley for good. Wendorf found 61 bodies. Many of them carried wounds. For decades, Jebel Sahaba was told as the story of the First War, a single terrible battle, caught and held in the ground. Then, in 2021, a French researcher named Isabelle Crevecoeur and her colleagues returned to the bones, now kept in the British Museum, and studied them again with modern tools. What they found was not one battle. It was something worse. They counted more than 100 injuries that earlier researchers had missed. Many came from composite weapons, arrows and spears built from several small sharpened stones set into a shaft, made not only to pierce but to tear. And crucially, many of the wounds had healed. Healed bone means the person lived, was struck, recovered, and survived long enough to be attacked again. This was not one bad day. This was violence returning, over and over, across generations. What could keep pulling people back into that? The researchers pointed to the sky and to the water. 13,000 years ago, the world was climbing out of an ice age, and the climate was lurching. Rivers moved, fertile land shrank. The Nile Valley became a refuge, one of the last places that still held what people needed, and refuges get crowded. When too many groups depend on the same shrinking patch of water, the soft space between them hardens, and sometimes it breaks. So how far back does this go? How deep is it in you? To answer that, you have to leave the age of arrows and spears altogether, and climb down a shaft in northern Spain, in the mountains of Atapuerca, into a cave whose name translates to the pit of bones, Cima de los Huesos. At the bottom, among the remains of at least 28 ancient humans, researchers found a nearly complete skull they call Cranium 17. It is roughly 430,000 years old, and above its left eye are two holes. In 2015, a scientist named Nohemi Sala and her team studied those wounds. The two fractures were nearly identical in shape, made by the same object, but landing from two separate blows at slightly different angles. A fall down a shaft does not do that. Two deliberate strikes to the front of the face do. Sala and her colleagues described it as one of the earliest known cases of one human being deliberately killing another. But notice what that is and what it is not. Cranium 17 is a murder. One person, one killer. And a murder is not a war. War is something more specific and in a way more chilling. It is organized and it is collective. It is one group deciding together to erase another. A single killing may be as old as the human face itself, but the coordinated version, the raid, the ambush, the hunting of an entire people, that is what Nataruk and Jebel Sahaba hold up to the light. So let's reconstruct that morning at the lagoon. The water is calm. Your group is small, a few families, maybe 24 people strung along the shore. You have fish drying in the sun, food stored in clay pots, children moving underfoot. It is a good place to be. That, in the end, is the problem. It is a good place and someone else has noticed. They come from the tree line. They carry weapons no one brings to hunt an antelope, heavy clubs, arrows tipped with glass that traveled a long way to arrive here. There is no wall to climb, no gate to bar, because your people never once imagined they would need one. And there is nowhere you can run that is faster than a thrown spear. It is over quickly. And then the lagoon is quiet again, the way it was before you were ever there. Here is the part that should unsettle you, and it is not the blood. For generations, we assumed that war was the price of civilization, that walls and kings and armies conjured it into being, and that everything before them was a kind of peace. Nataruk breaks that story cleanly in half. These people had no state, no king, no standing army, no city, no fields to defend. They lived the way humans had lived for hundreds of thousands of years, and they were still hunted down by other humans who simply wanted what they had. But the second look at Jebel Sahaba adds the twist that actually matters. This kind of violence was not a constant, humming background to human life. It clustered. It surfaced in particular places at particular times, where the land was rich and rare, where the climate was turning, where too many people were being funneled toward too little water. In the bones, war does not look like our nature permanently switched on. It looks like what pressure does to us when the world gets smaller. And the world has been small before. Which brings you back to now. You still live on a planet with a fixed amount of fresh water, of stable coastline, of land that will actually grow food. And that amount is beginning to move again, the way it moved at the end of the Ice Age. The lagoon your ancestors killed for is now a river shared between nations, a contested border, an aquifer, a strip of coast the sea is quietly taking back. The scholars who study the oldest wars and the analysts who study the newest ones keep circling the same uncomfortable route. It was rarely pure hatred. It was scarcity and closeness and the fear of the people on the far shore. The group at Nataruk did not die because they were monsters or because their killers were. They died because they were standing on the best patch of ground for 100 miles in a world that was drying out around them. You are standing at the edge of the water. The lagoon is calm. Somewhere behind you, a child is crying to be fed. And for the first time, you understand the thing your ancestors learned on this shore 10,000 years ago, the thing we have somehow never fully unlearned. The land was never really the problem. There was simply never enough of it to go around.